Okay, it's time to start. Hello, Dr. Tallamy. Hi, Bridget. Hi, everybody who's out there. I'm Claire Whitcomb, Chair of the Madison Environmental Commission, and I want to thank everyone here for sharing their lunch hour with a man who can only be described as a native plant superhero, Dr. Douglas Tallamy. My co-host for this talk is Bridget Daly, a Rutgers environmental steward and Madison Environmental Commission member. Bridget gets the credit for writing to Dr. Tallamy and asking if he could help connect the dots between the native plant movement and municipal policy, which, as we all know, favors standardized approaches to plant selection, mowing, leaf blowing, and landscape maintenance. Dr. Tallamy has been sent a few advanced questions. Please add yours to the Q&A. The chat, I think, is disabled. The presentation will be 60 minutes with a half hour for the questions at the end. If you need to drop off, we will send you the recording. Just so you know who's on the call with you, there are representatives from 14 municipalities across New Jersey. The Chathams, Morris Township, South Orange, Princeton, and Fairhaven are just a few. This event wouldn't have happened without the leadership of Mayor Robert Conley, Business Administrator Ray Cody, and Communications Director Michael Palese, who not only invited Madison Borough employees, commissioners, and department heads, but shared the invite with so many of you who are here today. And now on to Dr. Tallamy, who is a best-selling author, Instagrammer par excellence, and co-founder of the homegrownnationalpark.org, a movement that encourages keystone species and native plants in order to create the backyard equivalent of a national park. His work inspires so many of us daily. I mean, this is absolutely true. Dr. Tallamy, we quote you in site plan reviews. We cite you in Eco Garden Tour publicity and in the pollinator plant sale, which is like this blockbuster thing that Madison and 15 other towns do with the Great Swamp Watershed Association. And we've sold roughly 50,000 plants over the last 2 springs, and it's some X number of habitat, and I hope that all those homes are now on the map, as you say, on the Homegrown National Park. Dr. Tallamy, it's an honor to have you with us here today.
Well, thank you very much, Claire. Let me screen share. Okay, I call this Nature's Best Hope. You know, we do want to change municipal policy, but I always thought the best way to do that was to change what the public wanted. Municipal policy should reflect what the public wants. So that's what I've been trying to do. So I tell people, here's a spoiler, you are nature's best hope, and that's an awesome responsibility. But let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was, starting, well, he wrote this book in 2016. E.O. Wilson, of course, was extremely, well, the most famous entomologist alive, although he died the day after Christmas. He was at Harvard for many decades. And one thing that was consistent throughout his very long career was his love of life on planet Earth, his efforts to save it, not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential for our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And he had one simple message. If we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we have to save nature. We have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of planet Earth. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't tell us a lot about how we could actually do that. So to a conservation biologist, that's good news. We'll just put half the Earth aside and everything will be saved and happy. Problem is half of planet Earth, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. And we've got 8 billion people in the other half with all of our detritus and roadways and cities and airports. We don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So that's the big question. How can we actually realize E.O. Wilson's dream? That's what I want to talk about today. I think we can do it, but we need a new approach to conservation in order to do it. But before we talk about that, let's talk about what happened in 2019. We had a very large mass from the Red Oak Group. All the members of the Red Oak Group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head. then it forced its head through there, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. Finally, when it plops down, very dangerous time for this insect larva because it is good to eat. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. Takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly, stays underground in that chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down there at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in it, and that's how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, kind of like a true vacuum, and you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she's filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they leave acorns. And if scouts find a new acorn with a new hole, they get all excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move the entire colony into the new acorn. It takes about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard here, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? Well, that's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and fly up to a mile from the parent tree, and they tap that acorn beneath the soil surface. And the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. Specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have facilia. That is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have almost 4,000 species of native bees, and over 1/3 of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have a white turtlehead. I could talk all morning, all day, all year about nature specialized relationships. Point I want to make, though, this morning is that these relationships, nature itself is now on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states it's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition, and those are largely mountaintops. And that's because we've logged the country repeatedly. We've tilled it. We've drained it. We've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves, and each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need them to sustain. It is nature that keeps us alive on planet Earth. So why have we done this? I don't know, but I suspect we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. Of course, we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's 1/3 of our North American bird population already gone. And now the UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And they said it 2 years ago, so I guess that's the next 18 years. Makes a nice headline, but it is not an option, folks. These are the species that keep us alive on planet Earth. We have to make sure that does not happen. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk's about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me. But those efforts to deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if Earth lost its insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappear, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, those food webs would collapse and all those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients. All we would have is bacteria and fungi. Of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects. We can save our birds. We can save nature itself. But we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that healthy ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few things that plants do that we depend on every day. Like oxygen, pretty important. They clean our water. They slow its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their root system. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. Of course, once it's in the soil, it's extremely stable. Can be stable for thousands of years. Plants build topsoil and hold it in place. They prevent floods. They dampen severe weather. They convert sunlight into food. If we lost our plants, we'd have to eat sunlight, and that will be hard. What do animals do for plants? Lots of things, but that includes pest control services, very important. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea. But today it's a terrible idea because of those 8 billion people that are demanding more and more ecosystem services every single day. Now, we do have parks and we do have preserves, and they're doing the best they can. But we are now in the 6th great extinction event the Earth has ever experienced. So obviously it is not enough. We now need to start practicing conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes like this. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups who have been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing. Not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure where that was, but I suspect the notion that we cannot live together. Humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, unfortunately still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. But what I want to argue this morning is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head, and we need to practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, back to private property. Most of the country is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. And of course, we can't afford to fail. Now, when I use the word conservation, I'm not using it correctly. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are out there. That's been our conservation model for the last century, and we want to keep doing that. But it's now time, and we've got to go beyond that. We've got to put nature back together again. We've got to restore it. Restoration biology, restoration ecology. And before you tell me that you're never going to put it back exactly the way it was, I know that. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions so that we have functional ecosystems again, even if it's not exactly what was on a particular spot at some point in the past. But in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the species that are providing the most resources. And there are two groups that we can't do without. One is the flowering plants, and of course, the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They are capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, turning it into food. And that is the food that supports all the animals on the planet. So where's that food? It's stored in plant parts. If we don't get that food to animals, we don't have any animals, then we don't have any functioning ecosystems. Well, it turns out that most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants. That something is typically an invertebrate, typically an insect, and not just any insect. Turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other plant eaters than any other type of plant eater. No, more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee that I have in my yard in Southeast Pennsylvania. Up in Madison, you've got the black cap chickadee, just about the same bird doing the same thing. These are the birds that are feeders all winter long eating seeds, and we tend to think that's all chickadees need. Well, 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. And when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. That's true for just about all the birds that are out there. Their babies cannot eat seeds, so they switch to invertebrates, mostly insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not alone. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my grad students did a few years ago, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they're carrying food to the nest. And they're going to send those pictures to Ashley. She's going to identify the prey items in the beaks of those birds and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds in North America as she could. And it was successful. She got thousands of pictures, did a lot of identifying. The green bars here are the percentage of the nestling diets in the 20 most common bird families in North America, the percentage of those diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen to most of our breeding birds if we didn't have enough caterpillars in our landscapes? So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is its exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible, and the birds don't want a lot of that. And because they're soft, you can stuff caterpillars down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. If you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious, they're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and many beetles have really sharp edges too. And finally, caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate. Birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where the birds get their carotenoids from the prey items they're bringing back to the nest. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among those prey items. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting very convincingly that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? How many caterpillars do our landscapes have to make if we're going to have birds? Is 1 or 2 enough? 1 or 2 a day enough? Well, that's a good question. So let's go back to chickadees. There are a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? 1 or 2 is not enough. 1 or 2 a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get 1 clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. But they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count them. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you do, because in so many places, that's all we have. You have to have all those caterpillars in your yard because chickadees only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not include all of those insects, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that people are measuring these days. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that says we have lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups, the species that require insects and the species that do not. So things like doves and finches can actually reproduce on a milk that they make out of seeds. So they don't need any insects. And look, they didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years, but the birds that require insects, particularly when they're breeding, lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This does not prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. So we need to up the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing, and that is be pretty. Okay, we're going to keep asking them to be pretty, but now we want them to be pretty and ecologically functional at the same time. And there's no way they're going to do that unless we start putting caterpillars into those landscapes. So how do we add caterpillars to landscapes? Well, you do that by adding the plants that support those caterpillars. It seems pretty straightforward, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants don't support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which ones we include. And we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the crepe myrtle and all of the barberry and all of the burning bush and all the ginkgos and all the hostas and all the things we typically landscape with in our yards, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweed species. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Well, because plants have made them specialized. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And if you don't believe me when you leave today, if there are any plants with leaves on them still out there, grab one and eat it. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. It's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there. It's not because there are no insects that are out there. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know they're toxic. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plant lineages for which they have adaptations that allow them to beat the plant at its own defensive strategy, get around those chemical defenses. They have enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant lineage. So for example, if you remove the milkweeds from your yard and put in hostas, the monarch's not going to start to develop on your hostas. Can't do it. It's locked into milkweed. So it has two choices then, and that is fly away and find milkweed someplace else or starve to death. Turns out there's three kinds of plants out there. This is simpler than people think. There are plants that contribute energy to local food webs. There are plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs. And there are plants that actively detract energy from local food webs. A perfect example of a contributor would be one of our oaks. They're contributing more energy to local food webs than any other plant in North America. A good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo. Ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a pretty tree, nice fall color, but nothing can eat a ginkgo. So it's not adding any energy to the local food web. And a good example of a detractor would be a Callery pear, Bradford pear. Not only are they not supplying much energy to food webs, but they escape our gardens and invade our natural areas and push out the plants that do contribute energy. So in other words, they're actively detracting energy from local food webs. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to rebuild the food webs that support the ecosystems that we all depend on and everything else as well, we've got to choose the right plants or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants. Starting with my house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. I should say our house. This is where my wife and I moved in the year 2000. It was a farm that had broken up into 10-acre lots. It had been very old farm, been farmed for 300 years. The last thing they did was mow it for hay. There was just about nothing there. So our goal was to restore the local food web here. And you don't do that without adding caterpillars. But I'd never tried this before. So I wanted to see if I could get the Canadian owlet to make a living at my house. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet. That's what one looks like. It's a pretty little thing. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you don't have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow rue. And we didn't have any meadow rue. It was long gone. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace and planted them, and it grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for about 2 months after I planted it. And one day I was walking by for another reason. I looked over and it was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still surprised about that. So now I have a good population of Canadian owlets and meadow rue. So we've added 2 species to the property. The restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. I did know where there was some ditch daisy and power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds. I planted them. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, this year they took over my front yard. Well, I had to wait a full year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Bidens, but it did. And now we've got a good population of both of these. So we've added 4 species to the property. Wanted the hackberry emperor, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that ought to be at our house. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on celtis. We didn't have any hackberry. So I got a couple of hackberry trees and I planted them. I had to wait 4 years for the butterfly to find my hackberry, but it finally did. And now we've got a good population of those. So we've added 6 species to the property. And that is how the restoration proceeded. I did not add goldenrod, came in on its own. And along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. Now, this is one that hasn't come yet, the goldenrod flower moth. That's what its caterpillars look like. I don't know why it hasn't come yet, but it's still part of the fun. It's anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and I look for this beautiful caterpillar. One of these years I'm going to find it, and that'll be a great year. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. And I've heard that people don't like Virginia creeper, but I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It can climb our trees without girdling them. It's a good ground cover. Great fall color, makes very nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. They're very high in fat. It's a great pollinator plant. Its flowers are tiny and inconspicuous. You don't even know it's in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. Remember, when you're planting a pollinator garden, you're planting it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it is the best host plant to support the large sphinx moths that are a primary food source for cardinals. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double-toothed prominent in our house because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. Even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like that guy. It looks like a stegosaurus. Well, it's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm. And of course, we didn't have any American elm. We lost it to Dutch elm disease decades ago. But there are two big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. And every year they make a lot of seeds. So I got some of those seeds, planted them at home. They germinate in 6 days, grow very quickly. Today, those trees are 80 feet tall, and they did bring in the double-toothed prominent American elm. I wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. So believe it or not, we had no evening primrose. So I planted that, Enothera. The moth came, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded, but it's very cute. And I planted a lot of oak trees. These are just examples of the plant lineages we put back on our property. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they're such important trees. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local food web, and that's the goal, you can enjoy it right away. Because, and I can say that with confidence, because I planted my oaks, most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or as 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to call in the moths that create the caterpillars that run the food web at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange patch smoky wing, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on my property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves at that tree. So you do not have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to contribute to your local food web. It'll do it the very first year. It's what our yard looks like, or looked like before the Bidens invaded the front yard there. But we put a lot of plants back. Not all of them, still working on it. But our research has shown if you count the number of moth species in your local food web, you're getting a good measure of the productivity of that food web and the stability of that food web. So 5 years ago, I started to do that, count the number of moths. Haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. I'm still at it, but I'm up to 1,196 species of moths that are now using our yard because we put the plants back. Now we've got 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the land mass, we've got 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these species are types of bird food, we have recorded 60 species that have bred on our 10 acres, not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline we see all the time. The World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I am convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it wasn't that hard, and it didn't take that long. All we did was put the plants back. Imagine what would happen if everybody put the plants back. We could turn statistics like this around. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres, and a lot of people have less land than that, particularly in suburbia. Can it work on smaller properties? That's a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And they're in a development. They're surrounded by everybody with the big lawns. When they moved in, their yard was packed with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, other serious invasives from Asia. So they got rid of that. They planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature that they call a bubbler, and then they sat back and started to record the number of birds that are using their yard. And they're up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. She's right next to O'Hare Airport. She has 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She is not connected to any natural area at all. It's a pretty 1/10 of an acre because Pam is a native plant landscaper, but she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants and put in 60 species of native plants, a water feature, and then she sat back and started to count the birds that are using her yard, she says, with a glass of wine. And she's up to 124 bird species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, there's Pam's woodcock. You can go to Chicago and check it out. All right, there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way, and we do want to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we've got to reduce the area we have in lawn. We've got 44 million acres of lawn today, 40 million acres as of 2005. That's an area bigger than all of New England, and it's dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Why do we do that? Because it's a status symbol, and we also need places to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? I am not saying get rid of lawn. I am saying cut it in half. What if we took areas like this and turned them into this? I got this picture from Dan Getman. I never met Dan Getman. I don't know who he is, but he lives in Missouri, and he said, look, I'm doing it. I'm putting in plants. These are native plants. Well, what if we did that on 20 million acres? Cut the acreage of lawn in half. That'd give us 20 million acres we could put towards restoration right at home. We could create a new national park that I am calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badland National Park, Olympic National Park, plus Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? What do we get when we put some part of nature right where we live? We get the opportunity to interact with that nature, to have a personal relationship with the nature that supports us. We could do it at our own time and our own pace. All we have to do is go outside, or maybe even just look out the window. We can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, 375 million people, that was last year's figure, will be there with you. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is critically important to developing that personal relationship with the natural world, not mediated by somebody else. And it's particularly important for our poor kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying. We get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour. And they walk around a natural area for an hour. The teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get on the bus, and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and become friends with it. Alone. No parental supervision. They will come home again. I guarantee it. It's so important. If you know, when we hover over our kids as parents, we're sending the message that this is dangerous, that this is something to fear. And of course, the media reinforces that all the time. That's a terrible message to send to our kids. They're the future stewards of the planet. If they're afraid of nature, if they don't know what stewarding is, if they don't love stewarding, they're going to be lousy stewards. We can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they'll learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in a very modest patch of nature in Hawaii. It's a piece of grass with a hedge, but there are anole lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards can't see you coming. And then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you learn how to take care of the lizard, you learn how to be a good steward of that part of nature. You fall in love with that part of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress, catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture, so who knows? But I guarantee she's going to remember interacting with lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life, and I guarantee that will help her be a good steward of the planet. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Strinisty's Nature Play at Home, dozens of examples of how to expose kids to the natural world. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, please do so. Go to our website, Homegrown National Park. It's free. You register your property on the map and the amount of area you're going to be a good steward of. If you really are going to cut your lawn in half, that's great. You put that area down. If you're going to plant an oak tree, that's super. If you put one aster in a flower pot and help that migrating monarch or local bees, all of that counts. You put that area on the map, and then your little part of your county will light up. And the object is to get the whole country to light up. We are asking people to, yes, reduce the area of lawn. That's not helping at all. Plant more natives in that area, remove the invasives. Most people do have invasive species on their properties. Protect any natural area that might be associated with your property. Our product is national awareness, not just of what the problem is, but what the solutions are. We want to change the culture so that people recognize that they are the solution. Got to recognize that nature's not optional. It's essential, and everybody owns a responsibility to sustaining it. That map will also provide measurable progress towards the UN's 3030 initiative. We want to save 30% of the planet by 2030. That's not going to happen unless we record all of the successful conservation efforts on private property. The benefits of Homegrown National Park is that it converts hope into action. It mobilizes the efforts of millions and millions of people, a grassroots solution to the biodiversity crisis. It does not rely on governmental support, although we would love some governmental support, merges the national conservation efforts that already do exist, things like Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones, all into one visual that represents our success. Remember, we're not charging, so we're not taking any members away from these groups. And once that visual's there, we'll see where the biological holes are, where the holes in the biological carters are that we're trying to create. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to join Homegrown National Park. What plants should we put in the area where we take lawn away from? I'm going to argue that some of those have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the arch. You take it out of the arch and the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants and the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that are going to support that house. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. You're not through building your house once you have your keystone plants, but they're an essential first step. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives ecologically? On average, they certainly are, but there are a lot of natives that aren't contributing all that much either. So the question really is, do we want to use the biggest contributors, the species that are contributing the most to supporting pollinators and to supporting the food web through caterpillars, or not? What is making the most caterpillars is one of our oaks. That is the most powerful genus in 84% of the counties in which it occurs in North America. In the Mid-Atlantic states, oaks support 557 species of caterpillars. Just to compare, tulip trees, good native plants, they only support 21. So there's huge difference in which natives we select. Over 950 species of caterpillars supported nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. How do you know what the best plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the most highly ranked woody and herbaceous plants for your county will pop up. These are just examples, and the lists are much longer than this. I just ran out of room. Let's focus on the herbaceous plants here for a second. Not only do they make the most caterpillars, goldenrods, native asters, and perennial sunflowers, but they also support the most specialist bees. When you are planting a pollinator garden, you want to focus on the specialist bees because the generalist bees can use those plants as well. If you only plant for generalist bees, you lose the specialist bees. So if you have goldenrods, native asters, and perennial sunflowers, you can have up to 44 species of specialist bees in your yard that will not be there if you don't have those plants. So we're going to shrink the loam. We're going to use keystone plants, invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light. And that, of course, is not the goal. There's a lot of recent research that is telling us that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines. And these are all the ways that our night lights are killing insects, particularly the moths that make all those caterpillars that run our food webs. Very serious problem. But to me, it's good news. It's good news because we have to stop insect decline. We've got to reverse it. We've got to have insect increases. We've already lost more than 45% of the insects on the planet. And if we can reverse this by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. There are a lot of switches to flick. This is where you guys live right here. But we can flick switches. But I know what you're going to say. Oh, I can't put a light over my barn or over my garage or over my front porch. I can't turn those lights off because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on those lights so that they only turn on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to realize is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of those lights and put in a yellow bulb, even a yellow LED, if it's a real yellow LED, because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects. If we switched out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if we use LEDs, millions of dollars as well. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to modify our light system. Then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe or any of the mosquito foggings to come and kill all of our insects. There's a booming business around the country. And of course, they say it's okay because what they're fogging is a natural product, and it is a natural product. It's pyrethroids. That is a compound that is found in chrysanthemums to kill insects. This is industrial strength pyrethroids, but it is natural. But you know what? Cyanide is a natural product too. So just because it's natural does not mean it doesn't kill you. They also say it only kills mosquitoes. And boy, I wish that was true. But in fact, it kills all the insects, all the pollinators, all the monarchs, all the things it comes in contact with. There was a big monarch killed 2 years ago when they flew through Mosquito Joe, hundreds of dead monarchs on the ground. The interesting thing is it does not control mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. It's too hard. You have to kill 90% of them to get success. Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50%. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. And you do it through biocontrol. You get mosquito dunks. That's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera. So what you do is you get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay or maybe dead leaves, maybe dead grass, put it out in the sun in the summertime and let it ferment for a few days. It's going to build up the population of diatoms and algae, and that is what mosquito larvae eat. That becomes an irresistible brew to female mosquitoes that want to lay their eggs. So they lay their eggs in your bucket. That's when you put in a mosquito dunk. You get this at the hardware store. It costs about $9 for the whole sheet. Then the eggs hatch, the larvae eat the mosquito dunk, and they die. You might put a coarse screen over this so chipmunks don't commit suicide, but this is extremely targeted. You know, if your dog drinks it, it won't hurt it. If a dragonfly gets in there, it won't hurt it. It only kills aquatic diptera. So it's cheap, targeted, but you know what's even cheaper is a fan in your yard. That creates a breeze that is strong enough that mosquitoes can't fly into it. If you just want to use your yard on a weekend, have a picnic, get a fan. You don't have to kill anything to do that. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows those caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? This is just an example, but I live in Chester County, PA, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from the tree, then it emerges as an adult, then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't, 94% of them. finish growing as caterpillars up on the tree, and then they drop from the tree and wiggle their way beneath the soil surface and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. And we mow and compact the soil under our tree so it's rock hard. So any caterpillars developing in here drop down and die. I'm convinced that the way we landscape, particularly in suburban urban areas, is another major cause of insect declines. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. This is what most people do. You have a tree in a yard. I've got a new grad student this year who's going to measure how well caterpillars do in a situation like this. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a layered landscape like this, where you have a tree, maybe a dogwood here, native azalea, fern, ground covers. Caterpillar drops down. It's a soft landing. It can easily get underground because the soil is not compacted. Nobody's going to mow it. Nobody's going to step on it. Plenty of leaf litter to spin their cocoon. Survivorship will be much higher. This is where we can do our spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. You put beds around every tree. The tree will love it, and so will the caterpillars. Use native ground covers liberally, things like wild ginger. That's native pachysandra. There's Virginia creeper as a ground cover. Golden seal, May apples, foam flower, ferns. If you can see the ground, you don't have enough plants on the ground. Your trees and the caterpillars will love you. Another grad student, former grad student, Desiree Narango, did some wonderful work in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And her results suggest that we do have, there is room for compromise in our plant choice. She asked one simple question: can suburban landscapes that are primarily native support, well, how do chickadees do in suburban landscapes that are primarily native versus suburban landscapes that are primarily introduced plants? And when they're primarily landscape with primarily introduced plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you've got 75% less bird food. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Everybody had a nest box up, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, well, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to reproduce. If they did try to reproduce, those nests contain 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard from 0 to 100%, this is what you get. We focused on woody plants because that's where chickadees forage. The dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live that long. If you reproduce at this rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population. But if you make fewer babies below the line here, and that's what you do when you have a lot of non-native plants, then you have an unsustainable shrinking population. Now, right here is where those lines intersect. So liberally speaking, you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying the local food web. That's the area of compromise I'm talking about. We can't tolerate any invasive plants, no calorie pear, no burning bush, but there are plenty of ornamental plants that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? That's a ginkgo tree. I don't know if you saw that the first time. Why does Dan have a ginkgo in his native planting? He has a ginkgo because his wife likes ginkgo and she asked him to put it in. So he did. Is it destroying the functionality of this landscape? No. Is it an invasive? Is it going to escape and wreck the natural areas? No, it's just there. So I like to think of it as a statue. So there's Dan's statue. If everything was a statue, he would have an unfunctional landscape, but one or two is okay. It is not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It is the absence of the contributors, those really powerful natives, that destroys those food webs. So if we increase these, we can tolerate more of our non-natives. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design taken by a drone 400 feet up. You do not get more formal than that. And every plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. formalizes that. It tells your neighbor that this isn't just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's beautiful when it's in bloom. It's helping a number of species of bees. It's not very big, could be bigger. But if everybody did it, it would help a lot. What are we trying to help? Trying to help those pollinators. And it's not because of agriculture. It's not because they pollinate a third of our crops. They pollinate about a 1/12 of our crops. And I hear people say, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80% to 90% of the plants on the planet. That's not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Every place we need plants. How about this? A Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life that is here versus the amount of life that is here. It seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can. And more of them are doing it. And you can do it in Madison as well. Minnesota kicked this off a while ago with a cost-sharing program that encourages homeowners to reduce or eliminate their lawn or replace it with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's a very popular program. Pennsylvania has a similar lawn reduction program. There's an island off of Florida where the municipalities are encouraging people to, they're actually paying people to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yard. Burrowing owls are listed species. This is how the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on invasive ornamentals like calorie pear. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did. Fayetteville, Arkansas. South Carolina's banned them all together. North Carolina has a bounty on it. You take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. Utilities are giving people $100 coupons to use water efficient native plants. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs in California. This has gone up $3 per square foot rebate. For every square foot of lawn you remove and replace with a xeric planting. How about a tax reduction if you join Homegrown National Park? That sounds like a good idea. If you want more information on all these programs, then memorize that. Okay, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one's important. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. We like it. We like to visit it. We like to take a hike, but it's not essential. And that means when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature takes a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out. And there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature. We want to save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy them. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. These are wonderful places. We want to save them so future generations can enjoy them. I get that. Nature is enormously entertaining, but it's much more than that. We want to save nature so that we have future generations. A little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. We talked about that, but if we restrict conservation just to areas where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those areas are too small and there's too few of them. David Quammen has a great analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I don't like that language because it suggests there's places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we have to glue our rug back together again, folks. We got to put the plants back, not just to make biological corridors that connect viable habitats with each other so that plants and animals can move back and forth, but to revitalize habitats where we've destroyed the vitality. We want to put the plants back to create viable habitats. And when we do that, it's starting to happen, but when we do that, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet, but I don't know why. because every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. So why wouldn't everybody have the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. Mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with this mindset, you're taught them. We've been very good at teaching this one. We have not been very good at teaching our kids or our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. That does not mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, more and more people are recognizing the planet is in trouble. It's got a lot of serious problems, but people feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn. One person can use keystone plants. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can remove the invasives that are on their property. We didn't talk much about that. One person can modify their light system. One person can fire Mosquito Joe. One person can do a lot to revitalize the ecosystem on their yard and then enhance their local ecosystem instead of continuing to degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable. Don't worry about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Wow. That's all I can say is wow. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I heard you talking to Harding before. I've read your book, but you really up your game every time. Thank you.
I learn something new every time I attend one of your presentations. So yes, thank you. So we had a number of questions that were submitted in advance, which we'll go through. And then I see that people are also putting questions in the Q&A. So if anyone has a question, please do so. So Dr. Tallamy, other than some of the incentives that you mentioned that communities or states can offer, do you have any other suggestions for initiatives that you suggest undertaking by municipalities at a townwide level, by the local government to better support our ecosystems, whether it be zoning boards, you know, a town council or a Department of Public Works who maintains land in town?
Well, of course, you're in charge of the public plannings in Madison, and you can decide what they are going to look like. You can decide what the species composition of the street trees are. Of course, in Delaware, we just passed a law saying that nurseries are no longer allowed to sell invasive species. So we're not going to leave it up to an uninformed public. We're going to say, can't do that anymore. And, you know, the nurserymen support that because they want to help, but they don't want to do it voluntarily, because if one guy doesn't, he has a competitive advantage over everybody else. They want a general rule so that nobody can cheat. Those are all things that can help. You know, I say it with tongue in cheek, but changing the tax structure on any level would turn this around overnight. We know it works. Costa Rica did it. You know, they deforested most of the country and realized, ecotourism is our it's our biggest money maker. So they changed the tax structure and people are putting the forest back. It's revitalizing the coral reefs and so on. So they responded right away, and it doesn't take much. You just get what it does is give you social permission to start reducing that lawn and putting important plants back. We can regulate what HOAs, you know, they've got some ridiculous rules where everybody has to have non-native plants. They all have to be the same. The grass has to be cut to 1/2 inch. So I've been encouraging people to join their HOA and educate them. You know, these rules were established back in the 70s when we tried to get rid of rusty cars in the front lawn, and that makes sense. But then they went crazy and said, well, you know, we're high status, so we're all going to do this without thinking about the ecological consequences. And now there's a legal precedent. Maryland said that HOAs in Maryland can no longer tell people they're not allowed to put native plants in their yard. So we're moving in the right direction. Now, I'm not promoting ugly landscaping. This is why I say don't get rid of lawn. Lawn is a cue for care. It's a place where you're going to walk. So wherever you walk in your property, that's where the lawn should be, and it should be manicured so that it looks nice. And you tell everybody you are part of the local culture. You're just going to have more plants on your property. And that includes public parks. It includes all of the government buildings. A lot to do, but there's plenty we all can do.
One of the things that I encourage people to do, in addition to shrinking their lawn and planting more native plants, is leaving the leaves in place. Can you talk a little bit about that? And especially, maintenance of public property is
Right.
subject to criticism and complaints from
Yeah.
neighbors. How do you deal with that?
Well, again, we do want to follow the social norms for what a cared landscape looks like. And that means you're supposed to rake the leaves off the lawn. But if we have less lawn and we have more flower beds, that's where the leaves go. My son bought a house a couple of years ago, and the first fall he called me up. He said, "Dad, I've got too many leaves. What should I do with them?" I said, "Put them in your flower beds." He said, "I don't have enough flower beds." I said, "Exactly. That's where you put your leaves." And it's a great way to create a new flower bed. That's where you pack your leaves during the fall and let it smother the grass over the winter, and then plant right through it the next year. We should think of leaves as we think of rainwater. We want all the rain that falls on our property to stay on our property and infiltrate. We want all the leaves that fall on our property to stay there so that the nutrients that those trees used the year before will be broken down and returned to the soil. You get a closed nutrient loop. When we rake leaves away every single year, you're starving the tree over the decades. And that's why our oaks, which have an average lifespan of 900 years, we think a 100-year-old oak is old because we've mistreated it the entire time it's been there. Grinding them up with the lawnmower is people always want to do that. But of course, those leaves are packed with the insects that are part of the food web. So that does crush them all. It's better than burning them or throwing them out. But I would encourage you to keep the whole leaves and get them into your flower beds. Our plants are much better at growing through leaf litter than we think they are. You think you've got to rake them all away so your plants can get through. I can show you a lot of pictures of great beds that are filled with leaf litter, and the plants come right through. After all, who was mowing the leaves or raking them away before we got here? Plants are good at doing that. So
We often get asked about that, specifically how deep is acceptable typically for leaves on top of overwintering plants.
Yeah, 5 feet deep is not good. That will smother them. So a normal leaf layer. Walk in the woods and see what a normal leaf layer is. It's really just a couple of inches. And if you end up, let's say you really do have a yard that's well endowed with oaks and you have more leaves than your beds can take, then create a compost heap. And that will at least keep those nutrients that you're then going to spread around in your beds. But don't put them out to the curb as if they're trash.
Speaking of trees and going for a walk in the forest, can you talk a little bit about the ecological difference between individual trees and trees in forest settings, like the Drew Forest here in Madison?
Well, we plant trees as specimen trees. We want every tree to be isolated so that it's not competing for light or nutrients or water. It will, obtain its full spreading grandeur. The problem with that is it doesn't get to interlock its roots with any other tree. It doesn't get to exchange nutrients through root grafts with any other tree. And recent research has shown that happens all the time. So that tree's on its own. And then we get a big wind, a big rain, and over it goes. It's one of the primary reasons we're losing so many trees during storms in suburban and urban areas. So what we're promoting now is to try to mimic that forest situation by planting tree groves instead of individual trees. You have to start young so the roots will interlock with each other, but become much more stable. So I would say a minimum of 3 trees planted much more closely than you would think they want to be. Walk in a healthy woods and see where the trees are. They're much closer to each other, in patches than you would think. Then you form a tree grove, which you view collectively. Your eye takes in the whole grove, not an individual tree, and it's still aesthetically pleasing. But those trees are going to take care of each other just the way they would in a forest situation.
Don't they also blow down less easily?
Yeah, that's what I mean. The wind and the rain won't blow them over because they're locking. They're much more stable.
I've heard Chris Shore, who is on head of our Friends of Madison Shade Trees, who I think is on this call, encourage people that trees need friends for that reason.
They do.
Yes. Claire, did you have a question? I think you had a question about managing roadsides, how to manage roadsides.
Yeah. I remember Lady Bird Johnson talking about in the old days, like, just don't mow the edge of highways. And, we do a lot of mowing in municipalities. What would be some strategies in how to time it with a life cycle?
Yeah. Well, we mow way more than we need to. One mowing a year is sufficient to accomplish what everybody says we're mowing for safety and, whatever the reasons were. Not every 2 weeks. So we could save a lot of money, a lot of gas, a lot of pollutants by mowing less. But there are areas we should probably stop mowing altogether. If you picture the Taconic Parkway in New York, if you've ever driven on that, it's a median. And in some places it's all mowed, in other places it's a forest. They've studied whether or not there are more roadkills in the forest area versus the grass area. And if anything, there's more in the grass area than in the forest area. So it's not intuitively obvious. It's not more dangerous to let it grow up. You do need at least one mower's width on the edge so that a car can pull off safely. But we mow more than we need to. Now, a lot of people are proposing putting meadows and other things back so that we can have pollinator and monarch throughways along our roadways. We've actually studied that a little bit. There's enormous mortality for our insects along roadways because they fly and they get clobbered by cars. So I support that, but not in medians, because the insects have to fly across traffic to get to the median to use it, and they don't make it. And not on high-speed highways, because again, there's just too much mortality. We don't want to kill more insects than we're making. But we got more than 4 million miles of roads in this country, and many of them are slower, more rural roads. Those should all be, they would be great habitat. And if you have a very wide area on the side of your road, maybe mow, I don't know. Nobody's done the research, but maybe 20 yards in, and then from then on, you have great habitat. Because there's plenty of our roadways where we've got very wide margins that could be created into good habitat. We need a lot more research there to do it right, but knee-jerk of planning every single roadway, no matter how fast the traffic is, and in the middle of the medians is probably not a good idea.
Thank you.
In Madison, and I'm sure other communities have this too, our annual May Day, which is the first weekend of May. It's a townwide spring cleanup. Volunteers help clean up parks and truckloads of mulch are spread. What are some activities you would recommend adding to a spring cleanup day like this? And is early May too early to remove leaves?
Okay, well, by the way, you never have to spread mulch again if you save those leaves. That is your mulch. So you don't have to go buy it. No wood chip mulch. Wood chip mulch actually draws nitrogen out of the soil. It requires nitrogen to break it down, whereas leaves are returning nutrients to the soil. There is no, if you're saying, when can I rake all my leaves away without hurting insects? There is no time. You can do that. People think that as soon as it gets warm, they all come out for the summer and that's it. They don't. Species emerge, right through August, depending on their life cycle. That goldenrod stowaway I talked about, that comes out at the end of July. not in May, so I'd have to keep it around until its appropriate life history. But so, that's why for meadows and things, we recommend that you mow or burn a third, a third, a third, so the 2/3 are untreated every year. And any one spot is only treated once every 3 years. That way, the 2/3 that are untreated, nothing is killed, and it gets to recolonize the areas that are treated. So you're not going to have leaves on your lawn. There's no reason to rake them away in the spring. That's a cleanup that we've invented.
When you say treating 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, can you just clarify what you mean by treating?
Yeah, I was talking about meadows again.
Oh,
Mowing it or burning it. That's the treatment.
okay. Gotcha. Thank you. You mentioned the detrimental impact of outdoor lighting on insects and wildlife. Do you have any advice on how to reduce that negative impact from street lights?
Yes, and they're doing research on this in Europe. There are two things, and I didn't mention it. First of all, you want a shield that prevents the light from going up. The Dark Skies Initiative is all about this. You want the light to project down. That minimizes the exposure of the light. And you want to move those wavelengths in the warm direction. So the cooler wavelengths are much more attractive to insects. It's not a matter of LED versus not, because you can get all different wavelengths with LEDs. You've got to get the appropriate ones. And any of the warmer wavelengths that cast a yellowish light are much less attractive. What we need to do is get the light manufacturers to produce what's going to be ecologically less harmful. They've been thinking much more in terms of what gives the biggest brightness and casts the greatest illumination, which is a different approach.
Towns have lighting ordinances that, is an area for action. Also, in our site plan reviews, we do mention motion sensors and stuff, but there is some resistance to it because there's a feeling that it like particularly in a crowded setting, it goes on, it goes off for the neighbors. But
well, then the yellow lights is a perfect solution, and keep them on all the time, but make it yellow.
There's a question in the chat about deer, which is like an anathema to all progressive plantings.
Yeah. We have an overabundance of deer, and it's not just in the East, it's across the country. And it's an ecological disaster. It has created the Lyme disease crisis, but it's also created a forest restoration crisis, a recruitment crisis. There's no recruitment in our forest where we've got too many deer. Every little oak tree that pops up gets eaten. It's also created an invasive species crisis. We think that the invasive plants that we have are super competitive. They're super competitive because the deer won't touch them, but they eat all the natives. If you remove deer from that equation, our plants are very competitive with a lot of these things. So you can't talk about invasive plants without talking about deer, because they are part of that equation. All of this came together, 30, 40 years ago, where the deer populations exploded. And we so did our populations, and so did our use of non-native plants, and everything started going downhill. But there are many, many reasons to control our deer. We know how to do it. The fact that we don't do it is a social problem. That's a sociological issue, not an ecological one. Or we could return the predators. We do have predators. We've got bobcats, which are actually making a comeback in some areas. We've got coyotes, but there's still open license to shoot a coyote, no hunting season, anytime you want, for no reason. That's the only thing that could control deer for the first couple of days of a fawn's life. I don't think we're going to bring the wolves back, or the mountain lions, or the bears. But if we don't control deer populations as predators would, we're going to have these problems.
I'm going to shoot you one more question from the chat. This is an interesting thing. And I know from our work in trying to save the Drew Forest that, the forest provides a $1.5 million eco-service in filtering water for
At
50.
least it's much more than that, I'll bet.
Well, those were DEP stats. Other people on the call are associated with this and probably know more accurately, but Richard Fuller says he's interested in 45-acre natural area. He wants to figure out how to determine the eco-service, calculate the cost of eco-services that this area provides for free, and how can he find out?
Yeah, these are all estimates, but there are websites. There's a Forest Service website that tells you how much carbon various species of trees will sequester after 25 years, after 50 years, after 70, 75 years. So you can make estimates that way. There's a tool called iTree, again, from the Forest Service, where you can actually measure each individual tree and get a very specific measurement of carbon sequestration and pollution removements, things like that. So you need to know the trees that are growing in that 45 acres. You need to know the abundance of them. And you can come up with a measurement. The problem is we don't have a price tag on carbon sequestration. Now maybe through carbon trading we could come up with that. I'd love to see biodiversity trading, where you actually get paid to promote biodiversity, not just sequestering carbon, because that's not valued at all. But that 45 acres would be critically important in terms of doing that. And then you add all the water benefits. A lot of benefits from preserving that space. It's out there, but it's not particularly easy to put it together. Or if you knew the age of the plants in that forest, 45 acres, look for somebody else who's done it in a similar area and just come up with an estimate that way, because people are starting to do it.
Okay. Linda Beck in South Orange says that they are having trouble converting the unconverted. All of the lawn signs say we believe in science, but in some of the neighborhoods they're only doing monoculture lawns. Could you load us with some non-environmental arguments like financial savings that would get us a little further? Leaving the leaves means free fertilizer, native plants, less maintenance, blah, blah, blah.
Oh, yeah, I could. And there are people that have figures on that. But typically people that resist this, they don't, the savings are not big enough to sway them. It's about status. I want to have a perfectly manicured living space because that will give me the highest status. The only thing that's going to change that is to change our status symbols. And we're seeing this in the West. In California or Arizona, the guy with the big lawn is now the social pariah because everybody knows they don't have the water for that. Kim Kardashian got called out. She was flouting the water regulatory rules in California more than anybody else in Hollywood. So she was listed there. Say, hey, look at this. So we can do that in the East too, probably not from a water savings perspective, but from a biodiversity perspective. Look at this lawn, you look at this yard, it's absolutely dead. I'm thinking about this new approach, and it comes from Las Vegas. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Everybody knows that. Well, what happens on your yard doesn't stay in your yard. Everything you do in your yard impacts everybody else. And when people start to realize that, hey, you are wrecking my watershed, you are killing the biodiversity that runs my ecosystem, you're killing the bees, not providing any resources for them, you're polluting everything around me, that makes me upset. If enough people do that, then the people that are hard to convince might be easier to convince. I don't know. It's a matter of changing the culture, and culture change is hard, but it is happening. It is happening.
Well, there's a question from Greg who says, what are some of the most successful ways for community volunteer groups to encourage residents to join the Homegrown National Park? And I will say that one of the successful ways we've had here is having an eco garden tour, having these towns come together for a native plant sale. And, you can contact us for information on how to do that. But I feel like when neighbors wander into other neighbors' yards
Mhm.
and see how it's going, they walk away with permission to be different.
That's right.
And it's a matter of just sharing and creating community and being a role model.
Being a good example. That is the very best. The research over and over again says the thing that sways people the most is peer pressure. So we need to apply peer pressure. So
I just want to point out that, and Michael, you can jump on and say how this recording will be available, but some towns who couldn't get their officials to come to this have said, I'm going to do a screening of this. I'm going to feed the DPW donuts and I'm going to have them watch this recording.
Wow.
So this recording we're viewing as like a step. It's a keystone recording.
It's a step.
And so you can have a keystone event of sharing and joining and somehow in your community spread the word.
I've always thought of having a bring your neighbor night, the neighbor that would never, ever come on their own. And it's funny, Michelle Alfandreri is the co-founder of Homegrown National Park. She was that person. Her neighbor asked her to come to one of my talks. Michelle had no interest in that. She just retired from Manhattan and but she went only to keep her neighbor happy. And now she's running Homegrown National Park. So we need to do that a lot more.
Yeah, and it works. It really works. I mean, our municipal officials got behind us. They invited people from other towns. I think this is just how you create the ripple effect.
Claire, just to jump in, this recording will be made available within 24 hours to everybody that attended or didn't attend. You'll be able to view it on the Borough of Madison YouTube page. So you can share it with your elected officials, your planning board, your zoning board, your environmental commission, your friends, your neighbors, your loved ones, your enemies. So it'll be available for anybody to view.
Michael, there was a question about whether it could be embedded on a group's Facebook page.
They'll be able to share the link, and everything on there is on YouTube. You can embed it from those links as well.
Okay, Doug, can we prevail on you to do like an infomercial for saving the Drew Forest? Lydia Chambers, chair of the group, has said, as you know, Madison has its own homegrown national park. It's a 53-acre Drew Forest, half of which has been deer fenced and painstakingly restored ecologically over the last 14 years. Could you specifically comment on the regional importance of permanently preserving the Drew Forest?
If you send me all the information that you would want me to talk about, we could probably do that. Yeah.
That would be huge. And I think other groups on this call are similarly saving microhabitats, and this one is at risk of becoming high density housing. And we're trying to support the town in its arguments. And we're doing really well, but it's
good.
A home run.
Good. All right. Yeah, I can help with that. Send me the information I need.
Okay. I think that's pretty much it. There's a question about bird feeders. Maybe you want to just address that.
Sure. What is the question? Are they good or bad? Or
well, it doesn't contribute to the ecosystem.
Yeah, research has shown that bird feeders properly done, of course, they're helping the resident birds that spend the winter here. And I've heard ornithologists say there's plenty of food for them during the winter. No, there's not. I totally disagree with that. Not where in our densely packed human areas, the meadows are gone. The seeds that used to support the sparrows and everything are just a few of them left. So this is where bird feeders come in. It really does help. They enter the breeding season heavier, and they lay more eggs when they've had access to bird feeders and suet. Even the big guys, pileated woodpeckers, use that suet all the time. So you don't want to have them so dense that it's going to be a disease spreader, and you want to keep them clean so that you're never putting out rancid seed or anything. But most of the research says that this is a great thing for birds. And occasionally the sharp-shinned hawk will come and eat one of those birds, but it's got to eat every day. That's part of it too, is predation.
Well, I just want to thank you enormously. This is on behalf of Madison and the 14 towns. We had 86, 87 people on this
Great.
talk. And it's a Keystone talk. It's going to get shared.
Okay, good. Good. Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who came today.